The Fury by Alex Michaelides is a murder mystery set on a Greek island where a wild wind drives people mad. The novel challenges Agatha Christie conventions and explores childhood trauma.
On today's episode, 2 books in which natural elements are characters unto themselves. We begin with The Wind. Writer Alex Michaelides sets his new mystery novel, The Fury, on a windy, remote Greek island. The title refers to the wind itself, its strength, its unpredictability, and how both those traits can drive you mad. He spoke about the book with All Things Considered host Mary Louise Kelly, and they discussed how this novel pays homage to the murder mystery genre, but also how it bucks some traditions, and why The Wind is an ideal situation for a murder mystery.
7 people trapped on a remote Greek island. One of them will not survive the night. Well, that is the story that unfolds in the new novel, The Fury. The Fury, by the way, is a wild, unpredictable Greek wind, the kind of wind that drives you mad, as the author, Alex Michaelides, hints darkly on the very first page. Alex Michaelides is in our New York bureau. Welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm a huge fan of the show, so I'm very happy to be here.
Well, we are very happy to have you with us. All right, so just to be clear, we're dealing here with a murder at a house party on a remote island with a storm blowing in, and the killer is one of the house guests. So I have to ask, were you intentionally channeling Agatha Christie? I mean, she's clearly lurking in the background here.
Yeah, you can't write a novel like this without, on some level, referencing or being aware of Christie, because of course she did it first with And Then There Were None. And in my opinion, she did it best. And so many hundreds of writers have tried to do it since then. And so, it felt very important to me in writing this novel that I didn't just rehash Christie's novel. So what I tried to do was just to turn the whole genre on its head. The thing is that reading this kind of novel, because we all have read that kind of setup where people are trapped on an island, you bring all kinds of expectations to it. And so for me, the fun thing will be playing with the reader's expectations.
One thing you do very differently is Hercule Poirot never waltzes in. Miss Marple does not show up. Your characters are left to sort this out amongst themselves. Why did that appeal?
Why did that appeal? I think because that wasn't the kind of story I was trying to write. I felt that I wanted to try and bring this as close as I possibly could to real people with real emotions and very kind of complex psychologies. And so something about resisting an easy, tidy conclusion with a superhuman detective felt right for me. I wanted it to feel messy and as realistic as I could possibly make it.
What else did you do to turn the Agatha Christie convention on its head?
I think it was a lot about trying to bring a psychology to it. So, I think what really interests me is childhood and childhood trauma. And, I grew up on the very small island of Cyprus. And I was kind of a lonely, nervous, anxious child. I think I still am. And I was obsessed with films and film stars. And I thought if I could just get to Hollywood, that I would be very happy and all my dreams would come true. And so I did, and got there and worked as a screenwriter and realized I was just as miserable and anxious as I had been before. And so I started to look inward at my childhood and went on this huge journey of therapy, And I feel that all of these characters that I'm writing about are wounded children, and that's the heart of the novel for me, really, is that kind of aspect of it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a theme that runs through it. And you just said you were a lonely, anxious child, and you kind of still are. Your narrator, who we're going to talk more about, but is a man named Elliot, and he feels this so strongly, he sometimes talks out loud to the wounded child inside him. What were you trying to bring out there?
That was my turning point in therapy, I suppose, was this realization that we all carry this traumatized child around with us, and very often we confuse the present and the past, or rather the child in our head does. And it's only by sort of learning to communicate with that child, I think, that we can lead a more authentic and integrated life. And I thought that was a very interesting journey for a hero to go on in a book.
You just called him a hero. Elliot, your narrator, he is one of the house guests. He's not very likable in my view. Why put the story in his hands?
Oh, gosh, well, he may not be likable per se, but I think he's quite interesting. And what I tried to do, it was, honestly, The Fury was the most creative experience I've had because I changed the way that I write. For my first two novels, The Silent Patient and The Maidens, I plotted them for about a year before writing a word. And then with The Fury, I really wanted to have some fun. And I thought, I'm not going to plot this, I'm just going to write it. And as I wrote it, Eliot told me the story himself. And it was an amazing experience because I wrote it, with him speaking directly to the reader all the way through. And by doing that, I felt that he was sort of telling me the story, I suppose. And all of these things that I didn't know, like about his childhood and his relationship with an older writer named Barbara West, just appeared, on the page as I was writing, without me having even the names. Everything just sort of magically happened. So it felt like a really creative, joyous experience for me.
So this is so interesting. Without giving away any plot twists or who the killer is, you're saying you didn't know who the killer was going to be when you started?
No, I didn't. That's why it was so much fun writing like that. And it was hair-raising, and it led me to all kinds of difficulties. But in terms of a creative experience, it was fantastic.
When you finally figured it out, did you have to go back and unpick all these all these dead ends and red herrings that you'd laid out because you didn't know either as you were writing?
Yeah, Mary Louise, it's really funny you say that because, yes, there was a moment when the first draft had a different ending and a different twist, and it didn't work. And I showed it to my editors, and they both said, okay, you have a choice now. Either you can bin this book or you can go back to the beginning and try and work something else out. And I think it's a really good lesson in not panicking, because what happened was I put my laptop down for a whole month and I just walked around the park and I went through the story beat by beat by beat and let the characters take me in a different direction. And the one they took me on was much more surprising, much more interesting, and felt much more authentic as well. So...
One more character to ask you about, and I use the term loosely because it's the Fury, it's the weather, this wild Greek wind, and I'm interested to hear that you grew up on Cyprus. Is this a wind and a kind of setting that you know firsthand?
Oh, yes. I mean, Cyprus is an island of the Mediterranean, and one of the lovely things about Cyprus is its proximity to Greece and the Greek islands. And so I spent a lot of time traveling there when I was younger. The Greek islands are notorious for the wind. And when I was about 20 years old, I was on the island of Mykonos, and I was stranded there for 3 days because the wind was so strong that no boats could leave and no boats could get across the water. And I remember thinking then, oh, that would be a really fun way to trap people for a story. And then, decades later, The Fury emerged. So yes, it's also it's a metaphor for the heightened emotions that kind of run through the book too. It just felt like a very appropriate and happy choice of device, I suppose.
Well, and it's a wind that it's powerful enough to blow everything clean. Clues,
yes.
Evidence.
Yes.
Yes. All of it.
Yeah. Do you know, I didn't think of that, but you're quite right. It solved a lot of problems, actually.
There you go. Alex Michaelides, he's talking about his new novel, The Fury. Thank you so much. This has been great.
That's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Next up, fire. I know it's a cliche to say that art imitates life, but in the case of the new book Radiant Heat by Sarah Jane Collins, it's kind of true. The novel takes place in the aftermath of a wildfire that's devastated parts of Australia, and it was inspired by real events that the author covered back when she was working as a journalist in Melbourne. She told Weekend Edition host Scott Simon that the stories of the people she covered stuck with her for years after she met them, and shaped so much of who she is as a writer. In this interview, she explains more about what led her to write this novel, and what wildfires taught her about uncertainty and faith.
Sarah Jane Collins' novel Radiant Heat begins with her protagonist Alison King, who is an artist still alive and finally breathing air after she's been hiding under a wet blanket from a wildfire. She begins to move around, then finds a car in her driveway. A woman is dead inside. She is a stranger to Alison. But why does she have Alison's name and address in her purse? Radiant Heat is set in Australia. It is the debut novel from Sarah Jane Collins, an Australian writer who now lives in New York, and she joins us from our bureau there. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
The woman in the car has a name on her driver's license, Simone Arnold. And she does seem to have a lot of superficial traits in common with Allison, doesn't she?
She does, yes. That's the intrigue that Allison has to wrestle with.
What does she notice?
First, she notices that they both lived in Cairns, which is a smaller city in the north of Australia, quite far from where the book is set. She also notices that they're around the same age and that they sort of look a little similar to each other.
What do the police make of the dead woman in the car, who turns out to have all these potential connections with Allison?
They're pretty dismissive at first. They think that this woman is just trying to escape the fire, which if you've ever been caught on a highway in the middle of a fire, you might turn up any street that is familiar to you. And because Allison panics a little when she finds her address in the woman's purse, at first the police don't even know that the woman was actually looking for Allison because she keeps that information back just to herself. And she can't even really explain to herself why she does that. It's just an impulsive thing that she decides to do.
Tell us about this part of Australia in which the story is set.
So the town itself does not exist. It's fake, but it's in the same region as a number of small towns that were ravaged by a very serious bushfire in 2009, which was known as the Black Saturday bushfire. That fire ripped through regional Victoria and killed 173 people. It was, at the time, the most devastating natural disaster bushfire that Australia had ever seen. And these towns that these fires happened in are kind of on the outskirts of Melbourne, which is the capital of Victoria.
You were working at a newspaper then, weren't you, in 2009? Yeah.
Yeah, I was 2 years out of my cadetship as a journalist for the Age newspaper, which was Melbourne's broadsheet newspaper. And at the time of the fires, I was covering the County Court of Victoria, which is sort of the mid-tier court. And so I was not sent out to cover the actual fires, but I was then moved to the state politics office and spent most of the next year following the Premier of Victoria around as he announced reconstruction projects. And so I met a lot of people who had been through those fires in the year after they occurred.
And they stayed with you when writing this novel, in a sense?
They really did. And really, it's my time working at the Age that informs most of this book, not just the fire, but also that time covering the court system and being exposed to some of the more upsetting elements of criminal law and seeing the extent of violence against women in Australia. Even when it is reported, you just get the tip. You're not seeing the whole iceberg, essentially. And so because I was sort of doused in it every single day, it was it's quite confronting. And that was something that also stayed with me and very much informs what happens in Radiant Heat.
Yeah. Well, without giving too much away, we discovered that Allison and Simone have that history in common too, sort of, don't they?
Yes. And that is part of, I think, what motivates Allison to try and find our way to find some sort of justice for Simone and also for herself. Whether or not she achieves that is also kind of something that I really wrestled with in writing the book, because we often don't see justice in these situations.
What are some of the many reasons that at least as we've seen so far in our justice system, prevent that from being realized?
I think it's a really hard area of law. It's so personal. A lot of women are just unwilling to come forward in the first instance. And then when they do, there is a lot more doubt. I think we're quick as a society to not want to believe that the worst things are happening. And it becomes easier to say, oh, well, there isn't any evidence of this aside from what this person is saying. So, beyond a reasonable doubt is very hard to achieve.
May I ask, when you were a criminal courts reporter, was there a part of you that was preparing to become a novelist, that was salting away information, stories, the look in people's eyes?
Yeah, I think if you're a good newspaper journalist, you should always be kind of squirreling that stuff away anyway to write your piece and to give people the color of the courtroom in a way that brings them into the space. So I guess I learned from some pretty grizzled court reporters the things to look for and to keep an eye on, and not just how to take accurate shorthand notes of what people were saying, but to observe what else was going on around me. And I think as well, I personally became a newspaper journalist because when I was a little girl, I wanted to be a novelist, but I thought that wasn't really a financially sensible path. And so I decided what was the next best thing. It was to write for a newspaper. And that was obviously many years ago now, before the internet kind of destroyed traditional publishing. I sort of think
right,
that
when that seemed like a good idea.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's like I feel like it's a bad joke now to say, oh, when I was a kid, I thought I'll grow up and be a newspaper journalist because that's a solid career path.
Of course, a huge fire looms over the story, as it has over much of Australia in recent years. And I was touched by some words you have near the end of this novel. Throw yourself on the mercy of the wind.
Mm-hmm.
How do we do that?
When I wrote that, I was thinking a lot about some of the first-person accounts I read of Black Saturday, where people talked about how literally they would not exist still today in the world if the wind had not changed at a certain moment in time. How out of our control really our lives can be, particularly in the face of sort of it's not the right word, but the awesomeness of such a powerful fire, and how there's only so much you can do to protect yourself against really anything. You just have to have a little bit of faith in living, and hopefully you'll be okay.
Sarah Jane Collins, her novel, Radiant Heat. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.